Order, please. We'll now move on to orders of business with oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. This week, the Minister of Health said, and I quote, "One of the options being considered by the newly amalgamated Nova Scotia Health Authority is having fewer mental health units." Mr. Speaker, that is shocking news to people like Leanne Griffin, who has said that her brother, who is schizophrenic and bipolar, relies on the mental health unit at the Valley Regional Hospital when he is in crisis. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier why his government is considering closing mental health units when people like Leanne's brother so clearly still need help.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As I said yesterday, I believe what the Minister of Health said, that in some of those facilities across the province, the team may look differently, the service delivery may look differently, based on, quite frankly, what the clinicians across this province, what health advocates talk about across the province, and what community believes are their need in order to deliver mental health services to the citizens of the province, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health has continued to work with healthcare providers to ensure that the healthcare model that's in our respective communities across Nova Scotia is the one that meets the needs of that particular community and is the one that that community believes is in their best interest.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the Minister of Health said is that they may look differently in that the mental health unit in their community might close, Mr. Speaker. Well, I got to tell you, there are people like Leanne's brother that show up in our emergency rooms every day at our hospitals around the province, many of them in crisis, needing inpatient services, needing short-stay units like the one in the Valley, like the one at the Aberdeen and New Glasgow, Mr. Speaker. Those community needs include a mental health unit for people that need to be admitted for treatment, Mr. Speaker. I've asked regularly whether the Premier agrees there's a crisis in mental health services delivery, and he says no, Mr. Speaker. How can the Premier continue to say there is no crisis in the delivery of mental health when people like Leanne's brother may find the mental health unit in their community closed?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think the important word that the Honourable Member just said, may. The fact of the matter is he's creating fear among communities across this province, Mr. Speaker. The reality of it is the Minister of Health is out working with healthcare professionals across Nova Scotia to ensure that the proper health care supports are there for families across Nova Scotia. What I would encourage families across Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, is continue to work with their healthcare providers, continue to work with the Department of Health, the new health authority, to ensure that we have a comprehensive, Mr. Speaker, strategy and a comprehensive suite of services to provide to Nova Scotians in a way, Mr. Speaker, that the professionals know work on their behalf and not get caught up in the fear-mongering of the Leader of the Conservative Party of Nova Scotia.
The Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it is the Premier's Minister of Health who says that mental health units may close, and I'll table that quote again today for the benefit of the Premier. Mr. Speaker, that is the words of the government, that the mental health units may close. The same minister that told the people of northern Nova Scotia that the closure of the mental health unit there was only temporary and that would open by November, and yet it is still closed today, Mr. Speaker. No wonder people are worried. People like Leanne Griffin and her family, Mr. Speaker, no wonder. So the Premier has an opportunity to clear this up. If he's so worried about this issue, Mr. Speaker, he can clear it up right now, and I will ask him to just categorically tell us that no mental health units will close, and if he won't do that, will he call a public inquiry into the state of our mental health system so that we can clear all of this up for the people that need help?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Honourable Member that C in CA is not for clinician, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is the Minister of Health is going to continue to work with healthcare providers and families across this province to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that the healthcare services are in communities so that community members that require those healthcare services will require them with the right healthcare providers And I want to thank the Minister of Health, the Department of Health, Mr. Speaker, the new District Health Authority, and all those Nova Scotians that are coming together, recognizing there's a need in this province and finding a long-term solution to ensure that it is there for the long haul, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's been a great outpouring of donations from Nova Scotians across the province with respect to the resettlement of Syrian refugees, unparalleled probably, and it demonstrates the compassion of people in our province. Mr. Speaker, as Nova Scotia prepares for the Syrian refugees that will soon call Nova Scotia home, there are many things that the government should be considering, and one of these things is mental health, Mr. Speaker. Dr. Stan Kushner, local psychiatrist, in a recent news story outlines that it will be critical to examine the refugees' mental health. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this. Can the Premier outline what steps his government has taken to ensure that all Syrian refugees will be provided with appropriate mental health services when they arrive? The
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank the Minister for the tremendous work she's been doing on behalf of all Nova Scotians. And I'll ask the Minister to respond to the member's question.
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much appreciate the question. This is a very important question for all Nova Scotians and all Canadians at this time of need, at a time when there's 4 million plus refugees that are fleeing Syria to neighbouring countries. Nova Scotia is very much prepared and ready to assist. When we launched the 211 system, we received, and it's been 3 weeks, we received over 2,000 calls of donations, many of which were for volunteer work as well as assistance for donations, money and other things. I've also received calls from doctors, from lawyers, from optometrists, from many professionals that are willing to volunteer their services, including mental health. Thank you.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister. Refugees coming to Nova Scotia have been through pretty traumatic situations, making their way to Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and other countries. And many will require extensive mental health services that are culturally appropriate. In this year's budget, Mr. Speaker, the Immigrant Services Association of Nova Scotia, which has been a leader in the ongoing resettlement process in our province, saw their mental health funding cut, Mr. Speaker, by 24% for mental health services. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Premier restore the mental health funding to ISANs so they will be able to provide culturally appropriate mental health services as Syrian refugees arrive in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I want to thank all Nova Scotians for the way they're responding to this Syrian refugees. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member would know, the first 10,000 refugees that are coming into Canada, about 80% of them are privately sponsored. I mean, community groups across our province and indeed across the entire country. Families have come together to provide a new beginning for these families. I also wanted to tell the honourable member there was no cuts to the ISANS program. Those cuts she's referring to were by the federal government. Canadians passed judgment on that federal government. We have a new one in place, Mr. Speaker, who responded. Who quite frankly put Canada back on the map, Mr. Speaker, internationally, when we're known to be a compassionate country. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the national government stood up and told the rest of the world we will do our part to ensure that these Syrian refugees get an opportunity to start a new life globally.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to be argumentative on such an important topic, Mr. Speaker, as as mental health. It's not a funny matter either, Mr. Speaker, I have to say. But Mr. Speaker, this government, in fact, did cut the community grants program under the mental health strategy to the Immigrant Services Association by $22,000 from the $99,000 that they received. And I will table that. That's from the Minister of Health and Wellness, his department, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask the Premier again, will those resources be restored in light of the fact that we will have Syrian refugees arriving in this country requiring mental health and other medical services, and not only restored, Mr. Speaker, but in fact expanded?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I again want to tell her that the Canadians responded to a new vision, a new direction with a new government. The new government has announced, Mr. Speaker, that it will be restoring former cuts when it came to refugees coming into Canada that were provided by the previous government. We're encouraged by that. We're looking forward to continuing to work with the partnership. Mr. Speaker, but again, I want to remind the honourable member, and I believe what she's actually doing is endorsing our labour movement, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that we need to get labour costs under control in Nova Scotia so that we continue to invest in the services that Nova Scotians want to provide to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we need to be able to get to the point, so I want to say, and I really do appreciate the fact that she's standing up and willing to support that labour movement, and I hope as we transition through a new direction, we'll be able to continue to count on her support, because she's beginning to recognize, Mr. Speaker, good government when she sees one.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is Feed Nova Scotia Day, Mr. Speaker, a day when hundreds of Nova Scotians come forward and make donations to Feed Nova Scotia at their local food bank at various locations around the province so that those families in need who are struggling to pay for Christmas presents and food have a chance at a good Christmas, Mr. Speaker. The problem is not enough of that food will be fresh local produce. Mr. Speaker, there are solutions to match up farmers who have surplus produce to with the families that need it, Mr. Speaker. Premier says no action on that solution will be taken during this session of the House. I'd like to ask him, why not? Why not make it easier for those families and those food banks to bring a solution together that will help families in need this Christmas?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the honourable member farmers across this province are doing exactly what he's suggesting they should be doing, which is providing produce to food banks. I want to thank them for the tremendous work that they've been doing. What I've also said, Mr. Speaker, is that the bill brought forward by a number of people in this House at various times. I've asked the Department of Finance to look at that bill, Mr. Speaker, to see what the actual cost would be if there are any unintended consequences, not only to the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, but to the farmers. As he would know, some of them already receive a tax credit for that charitable contribution. So, Mr. Speaker, we haven't said no to the idea, but I think most Nova Scotians want us to ensure we knew what the consequences of that decision would be before we moved on it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, one way to thank farmers for the donations they make is to recognize it through a tax credit. Fact of the matter is, in other provinces like Ontario, where that has been done, the amount of surplus produce donated to food banks there increased dramatically, Mr. Speaker, meaning more families in Ontario could be helped. That's exactly what I believe all of us, or most of us, in this chamber would like to see happen here, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal Party in opposition was in favour of just such a plan, Mr. Speaker. Now they have a chance to make it a reality. So I'll ask the Premier, what happened to make the government change its view from in favour to we'll see?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I don't think anything happened, Mr. Speaker. When the honourable member from Kings West tabled that information in opposition, what he'd hoped for, that the government of the day would have taken that bill, taken the Department of Finance, and actually understood what the consequences could be. I want to remind the honourable member that's exactly what this government is doing, Mr. Speaker. He's taking it across the Department of Finance and tell us what the consequences would be, Mr. Speaker. So we will look at what this. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, as I said outside of this House, Mr. Speaker, we'll provide to give credit to whoever wants to provide credit. What we need to make sure, Mr. Speaker, is what is the financial consequences? Will it do what we expect to do? I want to remind the honourable member Farmers across this province are responding in the way that we know Nova Scotians respond to the needs of citizens of this province, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to thank them. We're going to continue to work with them. We'll assess that bill, Mr. Speaker, if it makes sense, if it will actually do what the honourable member thinks it will do, Mr. Speaker. We'd be more than happy to continue to move forward, to progress, and make sure it's there.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the new hospital in Pugwash was to include a collaborative emergency centre, the East Cumberland Lodge, Pugwash Professional Centre, and the Emergency Health Services Station. Right now, paramedics take patients back and forth across the parking lot in their ambulances from the hospital to the nursing home for their care. Kitchen and staff push carts of food and laundry bins across that parking lot from one building to the other. So I'd like to ask the Minister, Pugwash deserves the planned hospital to go ahead. Can the Minister of Health explain why the plan for the new hospital in Pugwash has stalled?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to say that I have met with the team who are involved with planning, been through the hospital, taken a look at the challenges that they currently have. We decided to put things into holding pattern while the Provincial Health Authority did a clinical services review, so that when the future Pugwash Hospital is built, that we will know exactly what services should be in that hospital.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Speaker, I'll table an article from the Citizen Record on a hospital build in Pugwash 12 months ago, and the Minister stated within a couple of weeks we'll be involved in budget discussions and we'll make a determination very quickly on the level of support, Mr. Speaker. The Minister said the facility would be considered for a 2015-16 budget. It's a year later, Mr. Speaker, and the people of Pugwash are growing concerned. I'll also table an article, even the MLA, who's advocating from Cumberland North, who's advocating for this, Mr. Speaker, has stated that he hopes for a groundbreaking ceremony this fall. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister of Health tell us when the construction will begin on the new Pugwash Hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member opposite and also our MLA for Cumberland North, who has indeed been a great advocate for this new facility. And while he would have liked to have had a groundbreaking ceremony this fall, he realizes that the new Provincial Health Authority must look at all services in the 4 zones across the province, so that when it is built, we know that we have the right services for the future. And we're definitely looking at the future of this area, because actually their population is starting to grow. They have more children entering school, and this area will get a new hospital.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier as Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. Last March, I wrote to Halifax Mayor Savage about a tender for redevelopment of Cornwallis Park. I had asked that it be used as an opportunity to create a community space respectful for all citizens. Cornwallis Park. Racism, Mr. Speaker, whether it happened 250 years ago or today, brings people down. And we all know the mark that Cornwallis left in our province. We do know that HRM councillors recently passed what I became aware of as a statement of reconciliation with its Indigenous people. And I think that's a positive sign. Will the Premier speak with Mayor Savage and ask that the Cornwallis statue be removed because it stands as a tribute to the near extermination of Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I had an opportunity more recently to be with a number of the chiefs in the Mi'kmaq community. I had also an opportunity to speak with Dan Paul, who I think all Nova Scotians hold in high esteem. We talked about this particular issue. He made a request of me when it came to the Cornwallis River as it goes through the First Nations community in the Annapolis Valley in Cambridge. Felt it was inappropriate that there would be a sign there that recognized Cornwallis. Very close to that Mi'kmaq community. I called him a few days later, having had an opportunity to look at it, had those signs removed, and we will continue to work with our partners, both municipally and our Mi'kmaq community, to ensure that our history is reflected, but done so in a respectful way, Mr. Speaker. And I continue to look forward not only to work with Mayor Savage, but the honourable member as we move through what has been a very difficult part of our history to see that we can make sure that we do right by all of our citizens.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Premier for the response and also thank him for the removal of those signs, because I know that is a matter that affects our Mi'kmaq people deeply, and to have to drive by those signs is certainly something that is good that they're taken down. Mr. Speaker, I received letters from students in Inverness, a grade 11 history class in Inverness. I was very impressed. Mr. Speaker, they asked for the statue to be removed. I know their teacher had mentioned, what message are we giving the youth of our province if we allow that statue to remain? Sunday, we know, is Acadian Remembrance Day. They know as well of what Cornwallis has done in our province. And some people, Mr. Speaker, I respect, feel that Cornwallis may be a part of their heritage, but I don't think it means they have to own what he did or celebrate it in the form of a park. What the Premier has said has been very positive. I would ask him, again, I'll let him comment, but I would ask him that this move ahead and that we, as a province and as a legislature, support the removal of that statue. Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I particularly also want to thank the students from his riding who obviously have put a lot of time and thoughtfulness into this. It reminds me how fortunate and blessed we are in this province to have so many great young people who are, we only hear about the very small percentage, Mr. Speaker, of young people in trouble, and indeed, in fact, the vast majority of them are like the students the Honourable Member represents, who are very thoughtful young people looking forward and looking back to see is there a way that we can ensure as we move forward collectively that we can deal with the things that we're not proud of. And I made a commitment to the Honourable Member that I would continue to work towards to do that, to make sure that our history is reflected, the good and the bad, but done so in a way that is not insulting or in a way that is, Mr. Speaker, having some members of our community feel that they are being ignored or, quite frankly, being insulted, as I said a few minutes ago, and we'll continue to try to find that ground that reflects who we are as a people, and I will continue to work with the Mayor and the Honourable Member to ensure that we can achieve that.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Acting Minister of Natural Resources. In past question periods, the Minister has agreed with the importance of creating community forest projects within Nova Scotia. In fact, I have a letter from him indicating his wishes to visit the McKay Brook Community Forest Project in Pictou West, and I'll table that letter. However, that visit never happened, although I will admit we both tried to coordinate that. However, as soon as the new Minister of Natural Resources began his duties, I received immediately another letter indicating he would not follow through with a visit. Can the Minister explain why there is such a disconnect between the two ministers in seeing the value and importance of coming to the forest and having us explain the meaning of it and why we need this project to happen?
The Honourable Acting Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To speak directly about the proposal that was put in by that group, it did not fit the criteria of a community forest that was established by the province, Mr. Speaker, and that is why its application was rejected by the province.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister for his answer. What I've identified, though, is that the land was given to Port Hawkesbury Paper. However, the representatives from Port Hawkesbury Paper were more than happy to come and view the land and see what we wanted to do there. Your letter came months after that.
Order, please. Just want to remind the Honourable Member for Pictou West not to refer to the Minister directly. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
The Minister's letter came after that, indicating a visit and still wanted to see the land, as well as the representatives from Port Hawkesbury Paper indicated that the onus would really be on the department because they saw the value. And in fact, in Section 10 of the agreement with Port Hawkesbury Paper, you have the ability to remove a parcel of land to make this project happen. So my question is, will you review the proposal again?
Order, please. Just want to remind the Honourable Member not to refer to the Minister directly. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Will the Minister please review the proposal again, as well with the Minister of Natural Resources, and consider coming to Pictou West and sitting down with the McKay Brook Group and discussing the future plans of this project.
The Honourable Acting Minister of Natural Resources.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. My offer still remains if we can coordinate a time for myself to visit. We will do that. I'm not sure when the next when my next visit to Pictou County will take place, but we will do our very best. When it comes to the allocations that have been committed to Port Hawkesbury paper, that was done under the previous government. The province is actually having a very difficult time right now because of the overall softwood fibre shortage to actually come through with all of the fibre that was committed by the NDP government to Port Hawkesbury paper as part of their plan. So I cannot commit at this time that any decisions will be made to change course at this point.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Victoria General Hospital flood that forced the cancellation of hundreds of surgeries was more proof for the minister that a plan to replace the Centennial Building had to continue progressing. On September 15th, the minister stated that the delay in the plan to replace the Centennial Building were caused by the shift from Capital Health to the Nova Scotia Health Authority, which led to another review of facilities across the province, Mr. Speaker. Can the minister provide us with the results of this review of healthcare facilities?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the honourable member and former health minister that the clinical services review has been completed. That work now is starting to translate into planning for the future. What facilities we need. What we need where across Nova Scotia, and we will start very shortly. In fact, many significant changes will get underway in 2016, and I'm sure he will like some of those changes because he was in the department when many of them started their momentum.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Capital Health District Health Authority had a plan to replace the Centennial Building with steps outlined on their website to be taken from 2012 to 2020, which construction was supposed to begin in 2016, Mr. Speaker. The minister has replaced the Capital Health, of course, with the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and a new schedule has been developed. Can the minister tell us and all Nova Scotians when construction will begin on the new building to replace the crumbling Centennial Building?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we know that the first phase of some of the capacity at the Centennial Building is now underway at Dartmouth General. It's in now the final schematic and design changes, and we'll be adding significantly to Dartmouth General as part of the overall plan for our provincial hospitals. And in terms of the phased work for the QE2, between 6 and 12 months, we will see work getting underway.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, southern Nova Scotia employment has decreased by 12%. That is the second worst decrease in any region in the country. It represents the loss of 6,900 positions of employment. Full-time employment decreased by 10% over the last 5 years, which is the third worst regional result in the country. The population of the southern Nova Scotia has also been decreasing at an alarming rate, 2,900 in the past 5 years. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is this. Since the member has not raised the concerns of the people of his region, will the Minister take the opportunity now to explain why his region of the province has been hit so hard and has seen such little support?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. I want to assure my colleague that I do share and express the best interests of the residents of the South Shore every opportunity that I get. But, Mr. Speaker, let's be realistic and let's not play politics in this game. The Canadian economy is struggling, and inherently every provincial economy is struggling, Mr. Speaker. We are changing the discussion around economic development in the province of Nova Scotia. The private sector are stepping up to the plate. They're leading that discussion. We're supporting them by creating an environment where small business and business in general is able to be successful.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, the unemployment rate is 10.5%, the seventh highest rate in all regions of the country. People outside the labour force have increased by 14% in the last 5 years, 4% over last year. Unemployment rate is 49.7%, which means less than half the population is working. We've seen hundreds of jobs lost in the film industry, and we know how important the film industry was to the South Shore. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is this. Does the Minister still believe that changes to the film tax credit are positive to his region?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know how many times I have to repeat this in the legislature. The film industry representatives have told us that the new Film Television Production Incentive Fund is a funding formula that is workable for them. In discussions with the industry, Mr. Speaker, they identified priorities for us, and a month ago we announced just under $500,000 that support them in advancing a strategic plan where the industry will lead, to my colleague's point. There's funding to support location services and a web portal, Mr. Speaker. There's funding for an FTE to assist the industry itself in moving the industry forward. Industry has told government to get out of the way and allow them to lead. Mr. Speaker, we're doing that with the film industry. We're doing that with every other sector within the province, Mr. Speaker, and industry is stepping up.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. For 4 months now, the people of Pictou County have been told that the short-stay unit at the Aberdeen will be reopened when the appropriate staff can be hired. And Dr. Teresa Vino, the Clinical Director of Psychiatry at the Aberdeen Hospital, yesterday told the Evening News that the jobs were posted, people applied, but because the number of staff needed has yet to be determined, hirings haven't taken place. And she went on to say, part of the reason that nobody's been hired is because we're in a position of an uncertainty with respect to how we're going to staff the unit. Why does the Director of Psychiatry have uncertainty as to how that unit should be staffed?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When the announcement first came about closing the unit at the Aberdeen, it led to considerable investigation of the practice that had been occurring there. It was time to make considerable change, put a new direction into how mental health services would be provided in Pictou County. With the clinical review going on across the province, it was a good time to take a long, hard look at what would, in fact, be the best delivery model for Pictou County and indeed across Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we've been hearing it's staffing. Today we're hearing maybe it's something else because there's a long, hard look being taking place here. It's been 4 months of long, hard looking. We learned yesterday from the article that when the mental health unit was closed, a study was initiated regarding the services provided. So I assume that's the study that the minister is referring to. I would ask the minister today, 4 months has passed, when will the study be available? And if it's available now, will he table it for the benefit of this House?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've had those meetings with Dr. Corey, Dr. Vino, to take a look at the direction that the unit will be going. What we certainly know so far since August 1st, 8 patients have needed short-term psychiatric care. They've all been looked after. We know that the capacity of the unit, we know that the approach of the unit, all that needs to change for the future, and I have great confidence in the psychiatric team in Pictou and the direction that the Provincial Health Authority under Dr. Corey is providing us.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister in charge of the Film and Television Incentive Fund. In November, we heard the testimony at the Economic Development Committee from Screen Nova Scotia and other experts in the film industry. They said, and I will table that, and I would also ask that the minister read it, because they said at the time there were 3 significant issues with the new Film Incentive Fund in light of the dramatic drop in the work, and that is the cap on it, the loss of the equity program, and the percentage or level of the incentive fund itself. When will the minister address these 3 concerns of the film industry?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. I believe earlier this week there was a similar question relative to the amount of money in the fund. There's been 9 projects approved, 9 production projects approved, Mr. Speaker, totaling $1.6 million. There's $8.4 million left in that fund, Mr. Speaker. And we look forward to future applications from the film industry to utilize the monies that presently exist, the balance that exists in that fund, Mr. Speaker. I don't think there's any more opportunity for the industry to use the money that's available.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, at the Economic Development Committee, Screen Nova Scotia and the film industry experts talked about a production which we now know to be the global show The Code, starring Jason Priestley. This $20 million series was lost due to the uncertainty in the Nova Scotia industry. It was lost to Hamilton because of a 2% difference in the level of the incentive. The fund in its current form is not working. When will the minister at least consider improving the percentage points of the new fund so that we don't lose out on any other TV series like The Code?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've had extensive discussions both collectively with groups and representation from the industry, and I've spoken individually with those from the industry, Mr. Speaker. The discussions that we've had with the industry, they have clearly said to us we have to change the discussion. There's too much negativism around the industry in Nova Scotia. Government agreed and representatives from the industry agreed, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we've tried to do recently with $500,000 in funding. Mr. Speaker, to that point, I want to table an article entitled Journeyman Bets in Film Industry Future. And Mr. Speaker, this was an All Nova Scotia report indicating Matthew Welch is bucking the trend in the province's film industry and investing $1 million in a new studio for his company, Mr. Speaker. This is a great example. This is a great example, Mr. Speaker, of individuals in the industry, Mr. Speaker, who are rising to the occasion. They're taking advantage of opportunities that exist, and they're prepared to utilize their own money to drive the industry. They're not calling on government, Mr. Speaker. They're stepping up to the plate.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Community Services. Pardon me. The Minister of Community Services surely by now recognizes that she has a problem she has not fixed within her department. That problem is within the Family and Children's Services in Kings County, where social workers have more cases than they can handle, and that has been reported, and I will table that in the Chronicle Herald. They have caseloads of up to 30 or 40. The Auditor General reported when, according to CPS standards, the recommended average caseload for CPS workers is 20 files with a mix of low, medium, and high-risk cases. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister is today, can the Minister tell the people of Kings County what she's doing to address this excessive caseload of her staff in Kings County?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start out by thanking the many, many social workers and child protection workers across the province that, quite frankly, do a job that many of us can't even imagine the circumstances that they face every day. I have made it clear, excuse me, sorry. I have made it clear and work very diligently with the Executive Director of Child and Family Services. We have a standard in this province. The standard is 20 in the caseload. We generally run an average of between 13 and 16. When it inches closest to the standard in any town, any part of the province, we make sure that we move resources into that area so that there are substantial coverage everywhere from one end of the province to the other.
The honourable member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that response, and I also recognize that this is not an easy job caseworkers have. Mr. Speaker, the Ombudsman has expressed concern in a July 2014 report about the heavy caseload for social workers in Kings County, and I understand that the Minister is making efforts to correct that, but this is to have 30 to 40 cases per social worker is a very, very serious situation, which we believe also impacts the quality of work that they can do. Is she confident that Mr. Speaker, is the Minister confident that the corrective measures that she is taking will address this heavy caseload?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I absolutely would address that if I felt that that was the case in Kings County. The information actually came from a social worker who does not work within the Department of Community Services. We have staff both in management on and in the ground in Kings County that monitor caseloads every single week so that we know exactly where we're sitting with caseload coverage, because at the end of the day it's about keeping children safe and making sure that families are supported.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. In the last 2 weeks now, I've had 4 calls from people who are dealing with maintenance enforcement. The one thing that is common to all those calls is the frustration of not getting through to the department. Could the Minister make an inquiry as to why this delay in communication is taking place?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think all members of the House know that the maintenance enforcement program is a priority for our government and for the Premier. And I have actually, in my time as Minister, been twice to their offices in New Waterford to meet the people and see what's going on there. It's an office that was extremely stressed 3 years ago when all of the other regional offices were closed and everybody moved to New Waterford. 70% turnover of staff at that time. So that's part of the history of where some of their disarray came from, and it was not a program that was working well to begin with. I would never say it was working well to begin with. So, Mr. Speaker, it's certainly in our sights to do better, and that's why I've been visiting. We're making every effort to do better, and perhaps in your next question I can add to that.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
No, that's very helpful, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for that answer.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Renovations at J.L. Isley High School have been ongoing for months now. Last week, Global reported that these renovations have created even more problems for students. One student said, and I quote, "In my math class, I was sliding around the classroom. Mr. Speaker, asbestos is a problem, and there's also a section of the school off limits because of gasoline fumes. One parent who removed her son from the school due to health and safety concerns as well, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Education is, what assurances can she give parents and students at J.L. Isley that it's safe to go to school?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. I think it would be fair to repeat in this House that safety of students in all of our schools is a priority for this government. We also recognize that there are deferred maintenance issues across this province, and for that reason, for 2 consecutive budgets, we have put aside $15 million each year for 2 years to address some of the outstanding maintenance, and Ilsley has been the recipient of some of that money.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'm told that the parents would like to see a new school built there, so perhaps the minister could think about that. Mr. Speaker, rural Nova Scotia is really hurting, and several regions like River John have now lost their schools. Yesterday, a concerned parent wrote the Chronicle Herald to express her frustration with the state of schools on the Eastern Shore, and the parent argues that dollars spent on cosmetic repairs could and should have been spent on a replacement of Eastern Shore District High and Gatesbrook Junior High. To support the arguments for a new school, the parent said she has the support of her Liberal MLA. So my question for the minister is this: does she believe that there should be a replacement school for Eastern Shore District High and Gatesbrook Junior High?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member's question, I would suggest to the member and to all members of this House that repairing a leaky roof and replacing windows and putting new doors in would not be considered cosmetic. Those are real necessary amendments.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. In the previous question, we asked about the caseloads for social workers in Kings County, and I tabled a report that said, a quote in the Chronicle Herald that said there was between 30 to 40 cases per caseworker. I believe I heard the minister say that was not correct. I would like the minister to explain this discrepancy in the numbers to me.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you. I believe the quote came from a social worker that does not work for the Department of Community Services, so their interpretation may be what they actually think is maybe not what is actually happening.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to request that the minister table that information, and I would further like to suggest that one of the reasons that I've heard for the discrepancy is, in fact, that when the actual number is 30 to 40, but when the department calculates it, they calculate it with the number with people in the department who are not, in fact, carrying a caseload, but are staff within the branch. And I would like the minister to clarify this. Does her number, is it true for the actual cases per caseworker, or does her average include staff within the department who do not carry a caseload?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I will clarify for you, and I can't table somebody else's opinion. That's impossible. But what I will table and get the information is what the standard is. And of course, we would not put a frontline person who was answering the phone in the statistics of what the caseload would be for clinical social workers who work with families every day. Clinical social workers who work with families every day is between 13 and 16, with the standard being 20. We do not include the people who answer the phone, the people who carry children from one place to another, the people who do assessments. They are the actual clinical social workers that are part of the standard.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Business. Last year, tourists and tourism employees were taken by complete surprise when the government abruptly closed its visitor information centres in Digby and Pictou with no notice, no consultation. Understandably, the communities who were spared from last year's VIC cuts are growing very nervous that they're the next on the Liberal government's chopping block. So my question to the minister is, what assurances can the minister give these rural communities that they will have VICs this coming summer?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Mr. Speaker, we continue to have discussions with communities across the province on the tourism industry itself and the need to change the industry. And I want to assure my colleague across that there will be 51 municipal VICs functional for the next tourist season.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the minister for his answer. However, last year, mayors in Pictou and Digby told reporters that they were shocked and blindsided when this government shuttered the VICs in those communities, and I will table that. And this year we're hearing reports that renovations to VICs are being halted as there are multiple sites that won't open again in the new year. So my question again to the Minister is, will the Minister commit to full and open consultations with communities before they have the rug ripped out from underneath them, which happened last year in Pictou and Digby? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. One of the things that I have committed to, and we continue to do, Mr. Speaker, is engage communities across the province. And that consultation that is ongoing as we speak has been exhaustive. It's been very thorough. It's engaged all of the stakeholders from those communities around the discussions of tourism and how the province collectively can double tourism revenues over the next 10 years. And I would share with my colleague that that those discussions have been very productive. We continue with those discussions, that there has been no decisions made, and at the first opportunity, Mr. Speaker, I'd be more than pleased to share both with my colleague and this House the outcomes of the discussions that we have embarked on.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. This issue is of extraordinary importance to the people of Kings North.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call public bills for third reading?
We'll now call public bills for third reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 139, the Municipal Elections Act?
We'll now call Bill number 139, the Municipal Elections Act. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I move third reading of Bill 139.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 139, the Municipal Elections Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried.
Bill number 139, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 300 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Municipal Elections Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered